My name is Elizabeth Lyon. I'm the Executive Director of COLLIS Institute for Catholic Thought and Culture, an affiliate organization at Cornell United Religious Work. COLLIS, for those who don't speak Latin, is Latin for hill, and our mission is to develop Catholic thought and culture here on the hills of Cornell campus and in the Ithaca area. In our campus panels, we aim to engage relevant, timely, and pressing questions by placing the Catholic intellectual tradition into conversation with the Academy. Tonight, we welcome 4 dynamic scholars who will probe at the interface of social science, religion, and theology to address the question, is it worth it to have kids? In my work at COLLIS and during my own time as a grad student at Cornell, I have found that this is a question very much on the minds of students, both undergraduates and graduate students alike. Can I have children given the career I have chosen? Is it ethical to bring a child into the world given the state of politics, society, the climate, etc.? Will I have time to have a family? It's also on the mind of the public. Every month or so, there's an article in the New York Times with a title like the following. Quote, given the state of the world, is it irresponsible to have kids? Opinion, your kids are not doomed. To breed or not to breed, I like that one. And why I'm resisting the urge to have another kid, and the price of modern parenting. These questions have also been on the mind of leaders and scholars in the Catholic Church. In his 2022 and 23 addresses to the General States of Natality Conference in Rome, Pope Francis characterized the decline in birth rate in Italy and the West as a, quote, social emergency and as an impoverishment of the future, a tragic poverty, stating that, quote, birth rate is the primary indicator for measuring the hope of a people. Francis sees in the falling numbers the diminishment of hope for the future. A particular concern to Francis are the women and men who wish to have a child but are unable to do so. Many young people fail to realize their dream of raising a family, he says. Generations who grow up in a social climate in which starting a family has been transformed into a titanic effort instead of being a shared value that everyone recognizes and supports. Tonight, we'll explore several facets of this question, is it worth it to have kids? What are the current trends in birth rate domestically and globally? What inferences can we make about causality? How are women and men deciding whether or not to have children? What other lifetime effects of having children? What can the social sciences tell us about current patterns of birth rate? And how does theology respond to these findings? How does theology respond to social realities? And does theology challenge certain assumptions about the value of children, both in society and in the social sciences themselves? Now, unfortunately, I have to announce that the moderator that was planned for tonight, Professor Daniel Gallagher, has encountered travel difficulties on his way here. And so he sends his profound regrets for not being able to be here in person. He might be able to Zoom in, I'm hoping. So I will serve in that role, but I'm counting on all you social scientists in the room for some great questions in the Q&A. The structure for tonight's proceedings will be as follows. So first, each of our panelists will make a short presentation. I will introduce each panelist before their respective presentation, and we can take a brief clarifying question or two after each of these mini presentations. After that portion, we'll have about 15 minutes of moderated discussion, and then we'll have time for Q&A, so do save your questions. Before we begin, I would like to thank the John Templeton Foundation, through whose support this event is possible. And I would also like to thank the Cornell Population Center, the Cornell Center for the Social Sciences, and the Department of Sociology for helping to spread the word about this event. So now I would like to introduce our first panelist, Dr. Nicholas Eberstadt. Dr. Eberstadt holds the Henry Wendt Chair in Political Economy at the American Enterprise Institute, where he researches and writes on demographics and economic development generally, and more specifically on international security in the Korean Peninsula and Asia. Domestically, he focuses on poverty and social well-being, and he is also a senior advisor to the National Bureau of Asian Research. Dr. Eberstadt will be joining us remotely tonight. So Nick, it's great to see you, and thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry I can't be there with you in person. Can you hear me all right? Am I coming through okay?
Yeah.
Hear me? Great. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. Of course, I recognize that the question, is it worth it to have kids, depends very much on whom you're asking. Of course, you can ask it to prospective parents, but you can also ask it to existing children in society, existing family members, other members of society, humanity as a whole. The different reference audiences for the question. I'd make just a couple of points, if I could, to start us off. One is that we have been living through an age in which there has been a seemingly relentless global march to sub-replacement fertility, to childbearing patterns which, if continued indefinitely, would lead to depopulation, indefinite depopulation in the absence of compensating immigration for the societies in question. We know that the United States headed into a below replacement realm about a little bit more than a decade and a half ago. I think everybody knows that the United States current childbearing patterns, if continued indefinitely, would lead to successively shrinking rising cohorts, 15 to 20% smaller than the cohorts of their parents. What may not be apparent, one doesn't always read about this, is that this is really a worldwide phenomenon. This isn't something which is limited to the rich countries. If it were limited to the rich countries, in fact, a fifth of the world or less, we've gotten to a point on our planet where something like 70%, maybe as many as 3/4 of the people in the world today, live in countries where below replacement childbearing is the norm. 4 out of the 5 continents are characterized by below replacement fertility at this point. Of course, North America, of course, Europe, of course, if you want to add in Australia as well. But Asia and Latin America are also below replacement continents at this point. India is a below replacement society. Thailand is shrinking. Its absolute headcount is shrinking. Almost every major country in Latin America is below replacement, and in places like Uruguay, there are now more deaths than births every year. When you do the arithmetic, it looks as if we may be on the cusp of a very momentous transition, and that would be to a transition to worldwide, humanity-wide, below replacement fertility rates. We may be there already. We can't tell yet because we're always looking in the rear view mirror, because we don't have complete vital registration systems in so much of the world. Now, there are a couple of consequences of prolonged sub-replacement childbearing patterns. One of them, in the absence of compensating immigration, that happens fairly rapidly, is a shrinking of labor force, of working age labor force. Another thing that happens a little bit after that is the emergence of what you might call net mortality society, places where year after year there are more deaths than births. We've got net mortality societies all over the world already. East Asia is all net mortality societies. A lot of Europe, net mortality societies, merging in other places as well. But small families also drive the profound aging of societies, population graying. Gray societies are not caused by long lifespans, they're caused by small families. Over the population arithmetic is overwhelming there. It's counterintuitive, but that's kind of the way that it works. If you think of pinching the base of a population pyramid, more older people will be part of that society. And so what we see with the declining fertility rates around the world is this increasing labor scarcity, might call it, net mortality societies, and profound graying of societies all around. We are also seeing in many parts of the world the emergence of what we might call epidemic childlessness. Japan is a pioneer here. Japanese demographers have made interesting projections in this regard. On current trajectories, according to these researchers, a woman born in 1990 in Japan has about a 40% chance on current trajectories of completing her life with no biological children, and slightly over 50% chance of having no biological grandchildren. It's almost like science fiction to think about what that would mean, how a society like that would operate, but I guess we're going to find out fairly soon. One last point I think I should make. Why is this happening? There's been a small mountain of sociological and economic research, social science research, over the past century and a half, trying to explain the decline in fertility in different parts of the world at different times. There are almost always fascinating or infuriating exceptions to the generalizations that come out of these studies. They all have some insights, I should also hasten to add. I find most persuasive work that was done at the World Bank about a generation ago by Larry Summers and Lant Pritchett. They argued that the best predictor for family size around the world, within countries over time, was the desire for children. And I think that turns out to be the biggest and most powerful predictor. It, of course, takes us out of the realm of economics and maybe into the realm of metaphysics when one starts to ask, that's all well and good, but what changes the desire for children? Because it's quite clear that in our present time, we've seen a really dramatic drop in the desire for children, not only in rich countries, but in low-income countries with cultural or religious heritages spanning the globe. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Dr. Eberstadt. So we have time if there are any urgent third-line questions. Based on what we can take a couple. If not, we can move on to our next panelist. We can pull our kind of general questions for the end. So our next panelist is Dr. Abigail Jorgensen. Dr. Jorgensen is Assistant Professor of Sociology and Healthcare Ethics at St. Louis University, and she specializes in family sociology and methods with foci in health, politics, and culture. Dr. Jorgensen is also a birth and bereavement doula, and her book, A Catholic Guide to Miscarriage, Stillbirth, and Infant Loss, from Ave Maria Press, has just been released. So Abby, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you all so much for being here. I'm very grateful to the Institute and to Dr. Lyon for putting this event together, and to each of you for considering these really important but sometimes difficult discussions. So thank you for being here. Today, I want to highlight 3 observations that have come from my academic research on family in the United States and from my community work as a bereavement doula, which is a medical paraprofessional who works with families who are experiencing miscarriage, stillbirth, or infant loss. First, the United States as a society is not well set up to support parents in having children. To see this, we need only turn to the maternal mortality rate, which shows that women are more likely to die in pregnancy, childbirth, or the first year postpartum in the United States than in any other highly resourced country. The problem is growing. In 2000, the maternal mortality rate in the US was 12 deaths for every 100,000 live births. And in 2020, it was 21 deaths, a 75% increase of the former rate over just 20 years. And these numbers do not include women who died alongside their child. These are only numbers in which case there was a live birth. The baby survives. Additionally, some women in the United States face a medical system in which around a third of providers still believe that Black skin is thicker than white skin, and that Black mothers therefore do not require the same level of attentiveness to medical issues that white mothers do. This means that in the United States, a Black woman is 3 times more likely than a white woman to die during pregnancy, childbirth, or the first year postpartum. So the process of becoming pregnant and giving birth are fraught physically, especially for women of color. And a person's decision to have a child is more physically dangerous to women in the United States than in other highly resourced countries. But it is not just in the questions of life or death that we see the lack of social support for parents. Expectations that no one needs parental leave, maternity or paternity related, pervade our economic system, which also assumes that everyone works outside the home. Even the setups of our smart devices betray our societal assumptions that if you have children, you can't possibly have very many of them, as exemplified by this wonderful screenshot that was shared in one of my Facebook groups after a mother tried to add a child to her Kindle account. It reads, "Limit reached. Families can have up to 4 children. You will need to remove an existing child from your family." Even our technology displays our societal assumptions that children are not a priority. Parenthood is not worth the social investment, and mothers deserve a mere 4 extra Kindle accounts in addition to subpar medical care. The second reality that I want to underscore is that people recognize and consider this lack of support in their family planning. I want to share with you just 2 quotes from participant in my Mom Call project, a research project that looks at how people decide whether they want to have children and how that affects their identities long term. So Caroline, a homemaker who's also a mom of 2, 1 in utero, when we did this interview, was planning to have no more children when she told me, "We're on our own, you know. Society's been all, here, you. Go produce some healthy, functioning, cute, contributing members of society. Here's a tax break, a little tax break. Church is no better. Go make kids, they say. But gosh darn it, keep those monsters quiet in church. And no boobs here. Don't want you tempting anybody by feeding your baby." These gaps of support have been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, which has had an enormous influence on women throughout the world. In my study, 57 people were planning to be mothers or were mothers hoping to be mothers again, and 55 of those 57 decreased their ideal family size when the pandemic hit. One of these mothers, Grace, explained to me as she talked about working outside the home and planning to have no more children, COVID made the whispered FU into a screaming FU from society. It really showed me how much society did not care about my child or me as a parent. After the 100th conversation with someone trying to get them to just consider the children, I hung up the phone and told my husband, "We can't do this again." Over and over, in interviews and in surveys, women responding to my study emphasized to me the way in which a lack of social support, which had been influencing their family planning even before the pandemic, became an even stronger deterrent to increasing family size or starting a family in the first place. Education efforts, public space considerations, masking and vaccination efforts, and workplace norms all were cited as common areas where COVID illuminated the lack of social support for families, and that impacted family planning. The third and final observation that I offer you is this. People particularly recognize and consider the lack of social support when it comes to grief. 1 in 4 pregnancies ends in loss. a miscarriage, a stillbirth, or an infant loss. Since the invention of the home pregnancy test in 1967, the accurate identification of these early losses has skyrocketed. Our best estimates are that 80% of these perinatal losses occur in the first 8 weeks gestation, meaning that in just the past few decades, people have begun to see with scientific certainty how many losses there truly are. And alongside more scientific proof that perinatal loss is shockingly common, comes the realization that perinatal loss support is shockingly absent. As a bereavement doula and a scholar of the family, I often encounter families who, experiencing the loss of their child, feel so unsupported in their grief that they decide to avoid having children for a little while, for a long while, or for the rest of their family planning careers, as they mourn on their own. Unfortunately, I also see this to be true even in the social groups we typically turn to for support after other kinds of losses. Notably, as I discuss in my new book, the Catholic Church. A lack of social support, particularly from the places where we seek it most, massively affects a person, especially when they are in grief, in everything from their trust in their religious community to their family planning choices. This leads me to one last note that I will make here. Most of the statistics and studies around family planning sidestep the question of loss. They rely on live birth data, like the maternal mortality statistics I quoted you just a few moments ago. And they emphasize the stories of money or fights about whether women should even work outside the home or become educated, instead of dealing with the questions that shed light on society's most basic failure, a failure to sit with those who experience loss, infertility, or parenthood in any of its other forms. This failure makes it much more difficult for folks here in the United States to answer the question of this panel, is it worth it to have kids, with a resounding yes. And this will continue to be the case until we rewrite the values by which US society operates, by incorporating parents and those who wish to become parents into our healthcare, into our economies, and into our religious communities. Thank you.
Abby gave us kind of a snapshot of the beginning of life and some of the questions that parents would think about as they make those decisions. Before we turn to our next panelist, any kind of clarifying questions? Yes.
So I'm just curious, you indicated, I thought, there had been an increase in the rate of maternal deaths.
Yes, in the United States.
What explains it?
We don't. A lot of research indicates that poor responsiveness from healthcare systems is to blame, so that's the main
So the healthcare systems have gotten worse.
that they're responding less to maternal is, I think, the easiest way to put it. So, for example, the amount of time that a woman waits in a waiting room when she comes in and says, I'm 8 weeks pregnant and bleeding. That's not a priority. That's not triage. That person isn't important to see over your stroke victim and your heart attack victim and your broken arm kid, right? Like those triages of where that person falls and the importance of the medical community mean that if that person is experiencing some kind of life-affecting condition for themselves, let alone their embryo or their fetus, they're not considered as important. And when we see more stress in the system, which we've seen over the past 20, 25 years, most certainly, the more that the system is stressed, the more the fault lines of the system tend to crack. And that's the biggest thing.
Do you know whether or not when this occurs, whether the hospital has been sued for malpractice?
That really depends. One of the big class action cases looks specifically at whether color of skin was involved. So I know that that is one place that has been legally investigated. And it's really unclear to me how a person who's in grief because they just lost their child, they just came to the emergency room, they just were looking for help, is now like, it's now their responsibility to report that and seek out the way to sue the hospital. That's a lot to ask of the person in grief. So if that is happening, it's not happening at the rate that I think it could.
One more question here, Ashley.
Thank you so much. I was wondering, you said now with pregnancy tests, we're able to know about more miscarriages, especially like earlier on in the pregnancy. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to like the theological explanation you might give like Catholic mothers who maybe experienced any of these sort of wonders. I can imagine like, I don't know what it's like, but I can imagine that situation being like, why and obviously this is the whole problem of pain and stuff like that, but I didn't know if, you have anything specific that you sort of give Catholic mothers as a theological.
I love this question. I wrote a whole chapter in the book about this question, right? But this idea of why someone would exist for such a short amount of time flies in the face of societal norms about where our worth comes from. The idea that we were created so that we do things, we were created to produce things. If someone could be created to exist for mere minutes, mere days, mere weeks, we have to question where value really comes from. Right? Where the value of a human being, whether human person or not, we can set that aside and still say where the value of that human being comes from. So I think that the question of early losses, especially now that we can identify them with more scientific certainty than we have been able to do, really brings to light where we place the value of a human being. Is it what we do or is it?
And I'm just going to elaborate on this tomorrow. We're going to have a book talk, lunch discussion of Abby's new book and Julie's new book. So I hope you can come, but if you can't, I'll make sure you get part of it. So our next panelist is Dr. Karl Pillemer. Dr. Pillemer is the Theology professor in the Department of Psychology here at Cornell. He's also professor of gerontology and at Weill, Cornell. And is a senior associate dean for research and outreach in the College of Human Ecology. Dr. Pillemer also directs the Cornell Legacy Project and is the author of the great book, 30 Lessons for Life. So, Karl, thank you so much for being here, and I'll turn it over to you.
Rely on the experts here. Great. Am I there? You're welcome. At the 7.5 minute mark, you can wave to me. So I want to take a different tack on this issue, and I want to echo Dr. Eberstadt, namely for any study or any finding I'm going to tell you about, that there is at least a controversial minority, slightly alternative finding. And this is why when you filter down 30 or 40 years of research into 7 minutes, it's a little challenging. So if there are people who study this out there, you may disagree, but I have tried to touch on some main points. So one of the questions that have been raised have been so apropos for this. And the question of if the desire for children is declining, and which of course a part of that is the social pressure to have children, so cultural and social values. And if our societies make it unusually challenging to raise children, I think those are parts of this puzzle. But the question I wanted to ask is, from social science research, do kids actually make us happy, either on a day-to-day basis or in a larger, more global way? And there are a couple of ways to look at that. One is to compare childless people with people who have children, or people before and after they have children. And you can do those with all kinds of other moderating variables. But the question is, any of you out there who do not have children and are pondering it, will this actually make you happier or not, having a kid? Let me start with the bad news. And that is that there are clear costs of having children that most people experience. So even though the one aspect is the fundamental life change. So before you went to college, you'd been away from home before. So college, you had some reference point for those of you who are in college. Before you got married, you had experiences with your partner, but a new child is a transformative event that most people aren't ready for, and it increases people's life complexity very dramatically. There's been a lot of research using kind of moment-by-moment monitoring, showing that daily strains increase. There are some aspects that are obvious, like decreased leisure. There are a lot of researchers who think that we don't emphasize decreased sleep and fatigue as a part of the problem of parenthood. There are clear financial, at least pressures, if not strain. The work-family overload and the problems with balancing work and family are another part of the stressful problem. They're typically much greater for women, because even though men's roles in raising children in actual childcare have increased in some studies almost to parity, women still greatly under benefit in the division of household labor, no matter how much else has changed. So there's increased work for women, and of course there's anxiety. And I show this only because guilty is charged. If I had to classify our parenting style, I'd call it a 24/7 terrifying, all-consuming worrying style. As I say, I know that. And there is an impact on marriage. If I were giving this lecture maybe 10 years ago, I would tell you that there is a U-shaped curve of marital happiness that begins relatively happy, drops at the birth of the first child, and never recovers until the last child leaves home. That's more nuanced now, although we do know that happiness in general drops in midlife, and that is one reason for it. However, at least even if the curve isn't exactly right, having a child that does negatively impact on average marital quality in the first year and continuing into the second year due to conflict and communication problems, stress, and changes in intimacy. Now, how about the benefits? Well, this has been more recent. So people, again, giving this lecture 10 years ago, I would say people with children are less happy than people who don't have them. I mean, and people who have children are less happy than when they were before. Now people, especially people who study positive emotions and happiness, have made this much more nuanced. So that, joys of parenting, most people in memory studies, if you ask someone for their most joyous moment, if they have children, they typically refer to the birth of their first child or to the birth of their children. We're learning more and more how children promote social integration more generally through kids' activities, through other things you're involved in. There's an enriched self-esteem and self-concept for parents because caring for something, has those components. It can promote psychological growth. This next point, you can interpret it as positive or negative as you will. But there's still, in our country and in other countries even more strongly, a sense that you have not launched and become a fully functioning adult until you've had a child. So there is this sense that you have engaged in normal adult life course development, which for some people is very positive, and for some people who decide to remain childless, of course, is not so positive. Studies also show a greater sense of belonging and meaning. To get biblical, I've seen my children's children. There's a sense of purpose. And children, in addition to these negative emotions, bring about some daily positive emotions. The one thing, and I think you did a great job of talking about moderates these things. One very important factor is age of the first child. If you delay child bearing until your late 20s or 30, there is much less of a difference between people with children and people who don't have them in terms of happiness, stress, and other factors. So having your kids really early is a factor. And fatherhood, men report way more consistently positive effects of fatherhood than women report. Motherhood, women are more likely to experience stress and anxiety, not that they don't also experience the positives. If I have time, I just want to say, this is really under-researched. So how does religion and religious values and spirituality affect whether having children is good for you or not? In general, there seem to be positive effects, and one of the major ways in which being religious leads to a positive effect is through religious-based coping with stress. And some people have identified 3 kinds of religious coping. Redefining a stressor as part of God's plan. So my child is sick, but it's God's trying to strengthen me. A second mechanism is partnership with God. So God is my brother, God is my father or mother. We're working together. I put my plans in action with God. And finally, surrender. So as a coping mechanism, I did what I could and put the rest in God's hands. So religion fits in a little bit. So to conclude, I think Harry Truman once said he wanted, a one-handed economist because he was tired of hearing on the one hand and on the other hand. This really is complex as to whether from a sociological and psychological perspective, it makes you happier to have kids. And I think you can see it makes you happier in some ways, creates challenges in other ways. On average, a parental status, though, I will say, doesn't make a significant difference in most studies. So people throughout the life course are not significantly happier in general if they have had children. This difference begins to vary more in the later years as child-free older adults have more difficulty sometimes organizing care. But in general, if you decide not to have kids, it doesn't basically make you miserable based on social science research, especially if it's voluntary. Of course, involuntary childness for someone who desperately wants to have a child is very different. So I want to just echo what the previous speaker just said before I stop. And I'll skip the last point. Much more positive effect of children on relationships and much less of this negative difference between having children and not in societies that really support having children. So that a number of these differences and stressors really begin to wane. People often point to Scandinavian countries, which have really, really rich childcare options. If we want to reverse, the declining birth rate, there are some people who I think would be inspired if there were, as you were describing, better supports throughout childhood for parents. So thanks. And if anybody has a quick question, happy to answer.
Yeah, you touched on it briefly towards, I think, the second to last slide about how.
Sorry,
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, so you touched briefly at the second to last slide about how, like, later on in life, childlessness seems to have a great effect. I wonder if you could touch maybe on if there are any studies on, I guess, like deathbed regrets. It's a common thing. You regret the things you don't do. Is that a common? If you didn't have children, you tend to regret that?
The answer, there are mostly, at least as far as I know, there are mostly only qualitative studies of that. There isn't, because it would be very difficult to do in a large scale. The answer from those studies is generally no. So that in general, I would say no, that there's not a lot of deathbed regrets if I never had a child. Partly that's because it's a bigger issue, but as people get older, and especially in the 80s and 90s and beyond, they regulate their emotions.
Progress.
Oh, is it progress? Yeah, that's good to know. I like to feel that we're making progress. They often regulate their emotions, that they've developed a coherent life story. So no, I think that we don't typically find that. Very surprising is, though, the general lack of difference post-60 in overall well-being, happiness, et cetera, between child-free and parents. And it's except the major exception is, again, when people need care, they compare themselves to others who have children. The major factor in all this, really, is that for anyone who's had them or been one, children, having children is not neutral. It just has extreme positives and extreme negatives when you look at it so it's high positive affect and high negative affect characterize it, and sometimes that kind of evens out. But yeah, that's a great question. It's inspiring me to look a little more. Sure.
So I'm curious as to do these studies control? I assume what you do is you go out and ask people who have kids and don't have kids, you're after that. Do you control for a variety of other factors?
Right, so that's why some of the early studies, exactly right. One, there's a selection bias if you compare people who have children and those who don't. Among people who remain childless, it might be people who, for mental or physical health or other reasons, cannot handle marriage or can't find a partner, and more highly educated, highly achieving people who simply don't want to do it because they are so successful. So that is a real challenge. And so people do have ways of controlling for those. It's more common now, I think, to do these sort of single cases where how you were before you had children compared to how you were after you have them. It also makes almost no sense to compare across categories or to include voluntarily childless and involuntarily childless people. So that's just beginning. There's, it's why these data, kind of everything I've said is tentative. But yes, in general, in large-scale demographic research, they do try to control for as many of these variables as they can. Did you want to wait until afterwards, or did you?
Yeah, let's hold on.
Yeah, because I'm just worried. We want to make sure. Oh, but I'd love any other questions later.
Yes, if you can hold your questions to the end, we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. We want to make sure that we accumulate all of this stuff. Finally, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Hanlon Rubio. Dr. Rubio is Professor of Christian Social Ethics and Associate Dean at the Jesuit School of Theology at Santa Clara University in Berkeley, California. Before coming to JST, she taught in the Department of Theological Studies at St. Louis University for 2 decades. Her research focuses on family, feminism, sex, and politics, and she's the author of many books, including her just released Can You Be a Catholic and a Feminist? We'll be discussing that book tomorrow as well. So Julie, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you. I am happy to be the theologian on this panel, following the social scientists who give you all the data. I see my role as a theologian like this. I try to listen first to what's going on. And in the words of the document from the Second Vatican Council, Gaudium et Spes, theology, the church is called to listen to the hopes and the fears, the joys and the anxieties of people, read the signs of the times, and in light of the Christian tradition. So I want to listen, I want to read these signs or analyze, and I want to offer what I think the Christian tradition says that's wise. So first, encounter or listening. What do I hear? Both tonight and in the research I did in order to prepare for tonight, I think I hear three major concerns, three things that make it difficult for people to think about bringing children into the world today. Having children seems selfish, especially to those concerned about climate change, right? Having children feels risky. How can we bring a child into the world right now, given the way things are going? And perhaps most importantly, and most broadly, having children feels scary. There's not enough money, especially because of housing prices, student loan debt, healthcare, education. There's a loss of freedom coming, a loss, and we saw this in the last speaker, a loss of peace of mind, of order, of control. There's a lot to be lost. It feels like too much responsibility, at least right now. And so people at least wait, and sometimes wait indefinitely. So why are people feeling this fear? I mean, I imagine that in some ways parents have always felt some of these fears, but it seems different today. Perhaps some factors are the isolation of contemporary parenting, the way that our nuclear families keep us apart from our extended kin networks and even from neighbors and friends who used to form part of an extended network that would help with parenting. The lack of structural support for parenting in the US, we've already heard about, of course, but also cultural norms, right? And we saw a brief cartoon. The cultural norm of intensive parenting and perfect parenting. These things weigh on people, making people feel like this is a huge ask, and then it can feel overwhelming. It's interesting to me that although, of course, structural support is important, policy responses to declining birth rates have not, on the whole, been successful. They can increase parental happiness, they can make it easier to parent, but richer countries have lower birth rates, and no country has successfully turned around a birth rate decline via policy. No country. Even Sweden, the Cadillac of parental support and family-friendly policy, has a birth rate that is identical to that in the US. And so though I support, along with Catholic social teaching, these kinds of laws and policies, this leads me to posit that the concerns are deeper, and the response needs to be deeper too. not just structural, but surely that. And not just personal either. I could talk for a long time about how blessed I feel to have spent hours and hours of my life in my 20s and 30s hanging out with my 3 sons and how much they mean to me today. And I would probably cry and that wouldn't be helpful. But what is really needed, I think, is a better count of what having kids is for. So this is where I think Catholicism does have something to offer in its accounts of love, children, and families. Is having children selfish? Not according to the Catholic tradition's account of love. Love is understood as inherently fruitful, inherently something that moves beyond itself. It doesn't end with the two, but spills over. The theologian Karl wrote, "Marriage is not the act in which 2 individuals come together to form a we, a relationship in which they set themselves apart from the all and close themselves against this. Rather, it's the act in which a we is constituted, which opens itself precisely to the all." And this, of course, begins in children, but doesn't end there. It's not just about these 2. Is it scary to have children? Perhaps a little bit, always. But the Catholic tradition offers a vision of children as blessing, as gift, even in the most difficult circumstances. But gifts that don't just belong to me, and gifts that aren't just my responsibility. Think, for instance, of godparents who are given to children. In the early days of the church, parents didn't even show up for the baptism. It was just the godparents that came. That was how much responsibility they were given. But think of the broader ecclesia, the church, the community, who also have roles in raising these kids. It takes a village, right? So children are a blessing and they're not a burden because they're a shared gift, not just mine. Risky, given the challenges we face? Perhaps if you understand yourself as going it alone. But if families are not simply isolated and nuclear and private, but if they're key parts of society, if they are, as Catholic social thought has it, schools of deeper humanity, hubs for integrating people, cells of society, that means that, according to the Catholic tradition, families have rights, first of all. They have rights to the support they need to do their work. And they have work to do. That is, it's not just for my joy and pleasure. St. John Paul II called families to 4 different tasks. Love and children, of course. But also he said they have this broader, they can't stop there. They have this broader social role. They're called to open their home in hospitality. They're called to go out into the world and serve it, get involved in politics. They have a social mission. So parenting from a Catholic perspective is about deepening love by expanding it. Not hiding from the world, but walking into the world with your people. About entering into a schooling, and I think it's a schooling for parents and children, in the demands made by life in common. Moving beyond self-absorption to concern for others. Having a place where we can think together about our habits of consumption, about how do we care for the earth, about how do we attend to the human suffering around us. Families are communities of disciples from a Catholic perspective. Parenting in the Catholic tradition is also a place for learning wisdom. And the fulfillment that comes is gained because of the sacrifice it requires, not in spite of it. Theologians who are mothers, and we've only had this for a relatively short time in the Catholic tradition, have written wonderful things teaching us about how pregnancy and childbirth and nursing are sources of wisdom, practices in which we learn to open ourselves, to stretch ourselves, to make space for the needs of others that are not our own. We might also learn from parent theologians about how parenting at its best means letting go of perfection, right? Letting go of the perfect house, the perfect outfit, right? The perfect ordered life. And also, it's about giving kids freedom to be themselves, not what we hoped or thought they should be, which maybe teaches us a little bit about God and the freedom that God gives us. Parenting in the Catholic tradition is a vocation. It involves stretching and leaving some things behind, and yet and still it brings joy and maybe not happiness, according to the studies, but fulfillment. It is not, of course, for everyone. There is a role for singles. We have a concept of spiritual fulfillment, spiritual fruitfulness, right? That especially applies to those couples who experience infertility. But it's fundamental. In some, Catholic theology seeks to respond to the anxieties and the fears of this generation, especially fears that parenting is selfish, risky, or overwhelming, offering a reading of the signs of the time, seeing both inadequate structures and limited cultural norms that may be getting in the way of a deeper fulfillment. It offers a sense that things can and should be otherwise, with social structures to support parents for sure. But maybe more importantly, with an alternative vision, an invitation beyond fears of risk or sacrifice, via seeing love as deeply personal and spilling over, children as blessing, offering wisdom even as they stretch us, families as communions of love called into and supported by society, parenting as a vocation to be embraced, not obsessed over, not done in isolation, but centered in community. Pope Francis claims that couples who reach out and welcome others in will find their affection does not diminish, but is flooded with new light. And the world needs that kind of light.
So much. Do you have any clarifying questions for Julie at this point? Save them for the general. Okay, so at this point we're gonna have a little stage change. So we'll have to. So we'll have a little bit of time of moderated discussion with panel, and then I'll open it up to all of you for all of your great questions. So I'd first like to return to some of the opening quotes from Pope Francis that I started with. So Francis characterizes the state of birth rate in Italy and Europe as a social emergency. He characterizes birth rate as, quote, the primary indicator for measuring the hope of the people, and therefore sees in the falling numbers a dwindling of hope for the future. So I'd first like to ask all of you if you could respond to these statements, both as scholars and as Catholics. Do you see a kind of social emergency or spiritual emergency? Do you see in this a kind of failing of hope of people?
Yeah. It's kind of theological.
So let's make the theologian first.
Yeah, these are interesting comments. I wonder if it's most helpful to think of it as an emergency. There are different accounts of what to do in light of this transition that we seem to be entering into. It's possible that we could transition. I do think it's important to attend to the reality that in many studies, people have fewer children than they would like. And that finding a phenomenon of people waiting to have children and then being sad that they cannot have children or have as many children as they would like. This seems important. And in focusing my own comments on the nature of things, the nature of love, of children, of families, I think I'm in sync. I would affirm in some ways what he's saying, in that there seems to be something fundamental about what it means to be human and what it means to love, that our fears aren't letting us get to. And in that sense, it's a crisis.
I wonder if we could, Dr. Eberstadt, if you would chime in for this one. As a demographer, do you see this as a social emergency? Should we all be worried and thinking about public policy right now?
First, let me say that I think that the presentations so far have been absolutely splendid. I'm delighted to listen to this rich conversation, very thought-provoking. I'll make a couple of observations, Lizzie. First of all, following Professor Rubio, I think that pronatal policies will likely be at best marginal demographically, no matter how expensive they are, because of the importance of desired family size that I mentioned earlier. So what affects desired family size? I mean, we get back to the whole question of values and outlook. We can't avoid that. In the United States, if you want to take a look at what tracks with larger family size, with higher fertility, and remember that's what correlates, I'm not saying what causes, but it's people who are more optimistic, all other things being equal, tend to have larger families. People who express more patriotism tend to have larger families. People who say religion means more to their lives tend to have larger families than people who don't. So we can't escape the question of values. And the question of values also gets back to the crucial essence of child raising. I've got 4 children of my own. I've got a son and 3 daughters. And as a parent, I can tell you that children are quite delightful, but one thing that they are not is convenient. And the crucial question of convenience and sacrifice is inseparable from the whole matter of having children, raising children, being a parent. No, I'm certainly not a theologian. I don't even play one on TV, but I am aware in reading of the Bible that in Genesis, the Lord, our Creator, gives an injunction to human beings to be fruitful and multiply. It's a command. It isn't going to happen naturally. And if you look at the sociobiology about human nature and human nurture, I think it's kind of thin. It looks to me like there's a lot more mimetic than sociobiology in the continuation of our species.
Thank you. Karl or Abby, would you like to respond?
So I kind of follow up. I think that's so interesting. And I was wondering, though, is it all negative or is it more nuanced in the sense that I'm just really thinking out loud, for which I apologize, but it would seem to me there's a difference between having a smaller number of children and large numbers of people deciding never to have children. I think a lot of people, well, first of all, the baby boom generation was a little bit of an aberration, and Nicholas, you can correct me if I'm wrong.
Sure.
Those were unusually large families. But also, young people often want to invest very heavily into 1 or 2 children. And if both parents are working, it just becomes much more difficult to have large families. So is part of it positive in the sense that the parents are planning the number of children to have and in part so they can space them and invest them. So I guess I have two questions as to what you think. One, it seems that there's a difference between small family and no family. And for some of the small families, it seems like there might be some positive rather than selfish motivation. Just wondering. I'd be curious what you think.
Is that to me?
Well, I was throwing it out to everybody, but it was sort of spinning off you.
Sure. Well, so as an economist, I'm not going to make the argument that the economics of childbearing doesn't matter, because it clearly does. But the metaphysics of childbearing also seems to me to be so powerful. I mean, what strikes me, as I think about this all the time, is we've never had as many people on the planet as we have today. And it seems, I don't know how I can measure this, but it kind of seems as if we've never had so many lonely people on the planet as we have today. It's just such a striking paradox. And it seems to me that it's difficult to separate that paradox from the current dilemmas that young people and prospective parents face as they think about going from 0 to 1.
I'd like to speak to that too. So in my Mom Paul project, I've been following 3 groups of women, basically professionally stalking them since 2019. And in getting to interview and survey these women repeatedly over the past several years, and if you didn't notice, accidentally, a pandemic, one of the things that's been really clear to me is how different the Never Mothers group, the people who plan to never have children, is from the Anticipatory Mothers group, the people who began this study with no children, living or deceased, and wanted to have children at some point in the near future. So that kind of difference in my sample, which was deliberately looking at motherhood identity and how people pick that, came specifically to hope in the future, which goes back to the quote that you gave us. But this question of 0 to 1 or 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4 seemed in my sample to be very clearly, do I trust this world enough to bring a child into it? And there are a lot of good reasons for people to question that. And there are a lot of really excellent reasons for people to go forward in a move of faith and hope anyway. But one of the things that we see people respond to here is it must be an economic thing, right? So different countries, to your point about nationalism, Singapore, for example, created a national night out where the patriotic thing to do is go home and have sex with your wife. So they gave everyone the day off, trying to increase the birth rate, right? There's a very explicit video on YouTube. Your parents should not know I recommended that to you. But this kind of movement, or in Denmark, there's a travel agency that will reimburse your vacation if you can prove that you conceived your child during the vacation. Because we're trying so hard to increase the birth rate, right? A Boys to Men concert was nationally televised in Russia. I can keep going with this, but that idea that if you can prove that you conceived a baby during our Boys to Men concert, we'll give you a refrigerator. It's these economic things, right? It's we'll give you the refrigerator, we'll give you the day off, we'll give you money, we'll give you a free vacation, but it's not we'll give you hope. We'll give you confidence that this community is going to be here for you. We'll give you confidence that climate change isn't going to be an issue, or that if you get sick or if you get really hurt during childbirth, you're going to be okay financially, right? It's not we'll give you hope, it's we'll give you stuff. And I think that's where the breakdown of policy that you alluded to really comes in.
So I'd like to turn to religion a little bit before opening things up to the Q&A. So I'll ask a few questions and feel free to answer any of them. So first question is, to what extent does religious belief affect the decision of a couple about whether to have children or how many? So we've talked about patriotism, general optimistic outlook. What about religious belief? So if you want to jump in.
I'm just very short, and you probably know as well as I do, but yeah, I mean, people who score higher on religious measures attend services more frequently, have higher religiosity, tend to have more kids. Mm-hmm. I mean, is that what? Yeah, I think so. The answer is yes, they do across major religions.
Yeah. And then another question. And these I am drawing from Dan Gallagher's notes, by the way. So Dan Gallagher is nonetheless present in some form. What have religious leaders, including Catholic leaders, said to help couples discern whether they should have children and how many? And what haven't they said that they should say? And we might also extend this to a topic that you brought in, Abby, about what are kind of the cultural norms of religious communities that might influence the decision of couples to have children or not?
Very happy to answer this question. So there are a couple of different ways that what church leaders say influence people's decisions, I think, on this topic. The first is through the Facebook magisterium, which is where people you know tell you what the church said. Like, you're not allowed to not have children, or you have to be trying constantly, like, be fruitful and multiply means every cycle humanly possible, right? And that is not actually what the other magisterium says. So that kind of relation of, this is what I think the church believes, or this is what I believe, and I want other people to believe it too, very quickly becomes a confusion between true theology and what people interpret to be theology, or what people understand the church to say compared to what the church actually really says. Then we have the second problem, which is that the church has been notably silent on some of these issues. There's not an encyclical on miscarriage. Stillbirth, infant loss do not come up in terms of pastoral teaching on this matter. The main way that you will see even infant loss addressed anywhere in church teaching is in talking about baptism, specifically that you can't have it in certain situations, right? And the question of in utero, ex utero baptism is one that we don't have to get into right now, but the idea that we have so much rich teaching on so many facets of life, and then when it comes to the loss of a child, which affects 1 in 4 pregnancies, there's so little out there, right? And there are things out there. There are people writing about this. There are people begging their church for answers or guidance or comfort. And we see a movement there, but we're not there yet. So I think there's 2 main problems that I see here. There's the, here's what I believe, and here's what I want people to think the church says problem. And then there's, here's what I'm begging my church to talk about. And we're only now starting to see more of that come forward.
Yeah, I think that we do have some good teaching on responsible parenthood that that probably is not widely shared enough. Francis tried to clarify it with some unfortunate comments about people breeding like rabbits and what wasn't. But off the cuff, sometimes he messes up. But I think what he was trying to say is correct. That is that the church does not say have as many children as possible. That the church offers space for discernment about how many and when, and that one can take into account factors of how you want to parent and your other responsibilities and your work commitments, because those are not selfish; those are also vocations. Right? So, and perhaps this theology is not very well known, and so people imagine that it's kind of this ultimate pressure to have as many as possible, and there's nowhere for them to take their fears, their anxieties, their weapons.
You know, I don't know if any of you know more about this than I do, but a common sociological explanation over, say, 40 or 50 years for declining fertility is a very simple one, and that's the widespread availability of birth control. I mean, people had very large families. Well, they actually managed not to sometimes. But so, you know, I think that was certainly transformative for family size when people engaged in family planning rather than in other methods. So I think, I mean, that's part of the depopulation is that people can do it.
Well, I wonder if Nick would like to comment on that, like from a demographic perspective.
I'll make two brief comments. One general religious point from Catholic Christianity, I think, is captured very well in a title of St. John Paul the Great's book, "Be Not Afraid." It's kind of scary to kind of jump into the abyss, as it may seem, in getting married and having children. There are transcendent reasons not to be afraid. That's one point. The second point has to do with the work of somebody who is not a theologian, Catholic theologian, but who is my boss, and that's Mary Eberstadt. And I point to some of her writing. She makes a point about cats getting stuck in a tree you know, when you see like the fire department coming out to rescue the kitten in the tree, what's that all about? That's a kitten that hasn't been raised around other cats and doesn't know how to get down from the tree. It's never learned, it's never seen it. We're at a point, I think, in a lot of countries, in a lot of societies, where we don't know, we're not familiar with the norm of everyone having kids. We're not familiar with the norm of everyone having marriages. And all of the social learning that is kind of like in the oxygen in places where these are the norm are things which are kind of gone or going in other countries. And part of what I think the church might be better about is appreciating the tremendous difference between kind of an all childbearing society and a 50% childbearing society, or a universal marriage society, and one where that's kind of the exception rather than the norm. Because there's a lot of teaching that has to go on in one period of society that you don't have to do in the other.
I do want to make sure that your questions are answered, so I'm going to open it up to general Q&A. For those of you on Zoom, feel free to, Josh, do you think you can monitor the chat and voice any of those questions?
What are the a priori reasons people cite for wanting to have children in the first place?
No, I think I'm on. Are you hearing me like the great and powerful Oz? You know, you would be surprised to know that in recent literature, there's not a lot on it. But one is kind of that list I had mentioned. A very powerful one is that it's still, sorry, is it being too, about that, is that better? Yeah, I think maybe we abandoned this. A major factor is simply because people think it will be enjoyable. I mean, they think it will be fulfilling. So in the case of many parents who aren't doing it particularly for traditional religious reasons that go forth and multiply, it's because people think it will be life enhancing, in our society at least. That's one thing. Two, people do respond to the feeling I mentioned, which is we do things in our life course that follow set stages. Or you might ask, why does everybody want to go to college? Well, they do it, you know, because you do things on certain life course schedules. So I think that also influences people. Third, I think people do who are in a permanent relationship feel like it completes the marriage. But I think increasingly from what studies we have, you know, people believe that it will be generally, you know, joyous and fulfilling and positive experience. There's a little bit in the positive psychology world too that it resolves existential dilemmas. So even if it increases your day-to-day anxiety, it can decrease your existential anxiety. Why am I here and what's the purpose of my life? So
Yeah, in my project that I mentioned before, the Mom Paul project, I asked each person, why do you want to have kids or why do you want to not have kids? And all the people who did not want to have kids had an immediate answer ready for me, were very ready. And all the people that I asked, why do you want to have kids? Just sort of, why would you not want to have kids, right? And when we started talking through that together, what became really clear is that there is this sort of commitment to my community of like, I'm going to, this is my hope for the future. I am fulfilled. I have given the gift to the world that I wanted to give in having this child. I think it'll be fun and adventurous and wonderful, and this child will bring joy to other people too. And then there's the sort of functional, someone will take care of me when I'm old, which I think plays into it as well. And you do that more in your research than I do, but.
Hi, I'd like to go back to one of the points about having children later in life, or we're seeing a trend kind of undeniably of people marrying later in life. Usually it's accompanied with a lot of anxiety about like having to support aging parents at an earlier age, or even having more grandparents than there are like younger people. So kind of like China, the one-child policy, and then probably even effects that we haven't really like thought of yet. So one of the speakers said we've lost a social oxygen of like parenting norms. So there's a lot of anxieties. In your guys' opinions, do you feel like there are any like upsides, or like perhaps even just like things on the other side of like benefits perhaps of us or the trend that we're seeing?
I'll say, I mean, if you want to take a look at the revealed preference, revealed preference is now increasingly for child-free existence. The revealed preference is increasingly for living by oneself. And I think we can say that the revealed preference is for autonomy, if it's described that way, for independence, if it's described that way, or self-actualization, if it's described that way. So it gets down, I think, to a sort of a de gustibus situation where you aren't going to be able to argue somebody in a kind of a logical, aesthetic, kind of debate that their preferences are incorrect, because they're deep preferences, and there's a reason that people hold them.
Just to follow up on that, Nick, I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit more about the ramifications kind of globally, like what happens to societies when you have this sub-replacement rate?
Okay. Well, I should start by observing that I was always a skeptic of the catastrophism that I regarded as surrounding a lot of discussion about the population explosion. Because the driving force in the extraordinary increase in human numbers over the last century was a tremendous increase in life expectancy at birth all around the world. I mean, life expectancy for a species has more than doubled since 1900. And I thought, well, if you're going to have a population problem, a health explosion is a pretty good one to have. In the same sort of way, I'd be rather cautious to tell parents or prospective parents that they're wrong about the choices that they're making. I'm not sure that I've got the standing for that. What I can say is that a sub-replacement fertility society will, as I mentioned, lead to a shrinking of working age population, at least as conventionally defined, to a very steep increase in elders, and eventually into a very steep increase in, let's say, the 80-plus population, where people probably aren't going to be working and probably are going to need a lot of care. All the more so since we haven't yet managed to come up with a remedy for dementia or Alzheimer's, despite over half a century of pretty serious work in this area. I would guess that'll eventually happen. I just have no idea when that's going to occur. It's most of the economic pressures from depopulation, I think, are things, I would argue, are things that societies can probably cope with. It's probably possible to maintain and improve prosperity. The wild card is what happens with families within this greater construct. Remember I mentioned that that Japan is heading towards a future where a typical woman is slightly more likely than not to have no biological grandchildren ever. So how is a place like that going to work? Who is going to be the support source for older people in a society like that? I mean, maybe we'll come up with super great AI. Maybe we'll come up with like really smart pet rocks or something like that. But what we know so far from a century and more of social policy is that government programs aren't a very good substitute for the family, but they're a very, very expensive one.
Karl, do you want to comment on that from your research?
Yeah, those are great points. I think that I have a whole lot of thoughts at once, and I'm going to make them very brief. One is that, that's a great point about the decline in child mortality, one which is typically given by demographers as a major reason for declining birth rates. So if you're living in sub-Saharan Africa and you now can be convinced that your children aren't going to die before they reach adulthood, people are then much more likely to have smaller families. So that's been a cycle. As prosperity increases, as health increases, people start having fewer kids. I think it's hard to separate this too from gender. So, the question about, is it better to delay childbearing? In general, research on marriage and the family shows that the overall divorce rate doesn't give you good information, because for college-educated people who have waited until their late 20s to marry, it's dramatically lower over the life course. So that there is in general a benefit towards waiting until there's greater stability. Like a lot of the problem that we see with parenthood is very young people and people who aren't, who don't have support or partners trying to struggle their way through children. So I think so I really would love, it's almost like because I also agree with Nick, it's like we have this global problem, but to a certain extent, on an individual level, delaying childbirth until you are fairly well established, are better educated, have more resources, and having fewer children on whom you can concentrate is sort of good at the individual family level often for people, and certainly frees up women to do many other things that they weren't able to do. I don't know, from being a Catholic and a feminist, I mean, does some of that relate?
Sure. No, I think the gender issue is important too, and I relate it to the question of maybe I have two things going at once. Not good. We'll go this way. Okay. So when speaking about desires and preferences,
I think there's just too many nice pictures.
So desires and preferences are, of course, not just our own, and they're shaped. And I think about, for instance, the work of the sociologist Joan Williams on women in work, and she talks about how women often abandon work, saying it's just not working because of their family commitments, but that's not necessarily their deepest desire, but it's just the reality given the lingering inequality in the home and the lingering unflexibility of the workplace. And desires might be different if work and home look different. And similarly, we have to ask where are these deep preferences and desires coming from? And if, in particular, women are feeling overwhelmed by this, and if families aren't set up to do this well, if workplaces aren't set up to do this well, if structures aren't there, right, that's shaping our sense of possibility. It's shaping our hope. All right, so and if people are more isolated, and if people if their religious communities aren't actually sources of real support, which is what people say now, they're places where people are friendly, but not actually a village. right? So if all that's going on, then that's going to shape their desires. So I would say, yes, there's an unfinished part of the sexual revolution, gender revolution, that still needs to happen for there to be, for people to be able to access those desires and have the hope that this can be a joyful, fulfilling thing.
We have time for one or two more questions. Amelia, you brought the kids, so you get the question.
Thank you so much, panelists. You've been amazing. I wanted to ask about the religion of Islam. And I hear a lot about in the news about how they're the fastest growing religion. They have a birth rate that can be, half a child or a whole child higher than some, societies that they immigrate to. And I was wondering if this is just a question, looking at the data, is their birth rate explainable by just the well-resourced countries versus less well-resourced countries situation? Or is it something deeper about their sense of hope or their culture or their religious practice?
Is that for me?
Nick, do you know anything about these areas?
I'll tell you what I know about it. So, of course, the Ummah is an extraordinarily disparate community, and there are places in sub-Sahara that are majority Muslim tradition countries where we're talking about 5 or maybe even 6 births per woman per lifetime today, places like Niger. A lot of the Ummah now is below replacement. And I'm thinking, for a fascinating example, Islamic Republic of Iran. Average fertility of about 1.6 births per woman per lifetime, not appreciably different from Europe. Tehran's fertility level, about 1.4 births per woman per lifetime, indistinguishable from Zurich. The fastest declines in fertility in the world today are taking place mainly in Muslim majority tradition societies, and often without, or typically without, the sort of socioeconomic modernization you saw in East Asia with big birth rate declines. What's going on? I would surmise or conjecture a big change in values on an individual basis. One last thing to say is these big drops in birth rates in the Islamic community worldwide are typically taking place without as much use of modern contraceptives as we see in other lower income societies. And what that tells me is something that we all knew, which is that parents don't think that children are, come from under cabbages anyhow. There are all sorts of different ways of, regulating family size if you are interested in regulating your family size.
Rick, I'll give you the last question, and then don't worry, there will still be time for us to chat together. But
all right, thanks, and thank you all. This has really been fascinating. This question is for Abby, and it's springing off of it's Julie or Julia, something that you said, and that really had to do with the support for women and for families. And so most of our experience, at least with respect to religious communities, practicing is at the parish level. So my question for you is, if you have seen anything that's been particularly effective in the way of ministries or practices or things that support families in general and moms in particular.
Really excited for this question. Thank you for that. So hopefully you can end on a note of hope, given that that's one of the themes that we've been talking about, been lacking. So in the parish setting, one of the things that I find when I work with families as their bereavement and doula is that how grief informed, meaning how prepared to handle a perinatal loss situation your priest is, really matters, but also how grief informed your parish secretary is really matters. Because when you call that parish
and say, I don't know what to do, I had a miscarriage, the first person you talk to is not a person who has gone through extensive pastoral ministry training, right? It is the person who very kindly answers the phones every single day. So one of the efforts that I have in conjunction with this book is we're getting emotional first aid cards into as many parishes as possible so that parish secretaries, priests who haven't helped a family through a miscarriage before, those kinds of people have easy access to what are you supposed to say? Because that's a terrifying question to ask, right? We also see some parishes have really robust systems of support, even including like virtual support groups that meet every month. Ava's Grace is one that's open to anyone in the United States, for example, run out of the Diocese of South Bend, Fort Wayne. And that kind of idea of providing a space for families to continue to mourn together, a community where people continue to go back and be heard and be seen, that is beautiful, and that is something that's fairly low cost that many parishes or dioceses can implement. I will also say I am running the national study of diocesan support regarding perinatal loss right now at SLU, which is looking at diocesan level support because a lot of the policies that affect what priests can or cannot offer families in a parish are actually determined at the diocesan level. So for example, you cannot have a funeral mass for an unbaptized baby unless your diocese has approved that. And not every diocese in the United States has approved that. So in this study, we are looking at every single diocese, what their policies are. We're making that database available for families. And we're also analyzing, literally analyzing, like in process. That was what I was working on the plane on the way here, so I don't know the answer yet. But we're looking at, is there more support in dioceses and parishes that have higher stillbirth rates, that have higher coverage of medical insurance, that have more reports of malpractice or fewer reports of malpractice? Like, these are things we can actually find out and hopefully give people more tools to make there be more support available at your parish. But in the meantime, if you are a person at your parish who is willing to sit in someone's pain with them when they have a loss, I think that is the single greatest thing that we can do.
I'd say one, I want to give you a moment to process that because that's so important. I do want to give one last little hopeful thing if I can. In preparation for this talk, I was looking at the surveys that, the Pew Trust does, the Pew, it's not the Memorial Trust, but it's their huge survey. And so one of the things I did notice in these trends about whether young people plan to have children is less of a growth in know and much of a larger growth in don't know. So I, because now I think there were, over half in the most recent survey of people under 34 was, yes, I want to have children. And I'm not sure or don't know, like we're in the 30+%. So maybe that's a little bit hopeful. Like people at least haven't said definitively no yet.
Kind of like this trend of each person ending with a note of hope. So I don't know, Julie, do you have a note of hope that you want to end on?
I am inspired by my co-panelists here, and also think that this idea that Abby is putting to us, not just that we need structures for sure, but we also have things that we can do in our communities ourselves. And one thing I came across in research was that where the birth rates were softer, were in places where people had strong religious communities that actually supported them. So, and I think we still have to imagine what those kinds of supports might look like in terms of parenting groups and childcare and all those kinds of things. Of course, doing all that while making sure that singles also feel like they're a part of things.
Thanks. And Nick, would you like to also leave us with a note of hope or final thought?
We don't know when the next great religious awakening is going to come to the United States. We probably won't know until it's already underway for some time. But our country has had successive great religious awakenings, and they've had positive repercussions for our country. I think that probably would also have positive repercussions for our birth rate.
Thank you. Thank you. So we have come to the end of our time formally tonight. So first, join me in thanking this incredible group of panelists. It's just been I wish we could keep all of you here all week. Fortunately, we can keep 2 of you here tomorrow. Tomorrow we will be having a lunch discussion on Julie and Abby's new books. They're like pretty much hot off the press. In the case of Abby's book, it's not even technically off the press yet, not officially released, but we have secret advanced copies. So that will be tomorrow, 1 to 2 p.m. in 114 Annabelle Taylor Hall. We'll also have lunch. If you want to help us out, if you think you're going to come, you can go on the COLLIS website and sign up, just so we know how many to expect for lunch. And we do have some free copies of both of their books that we can give away. So Julie's book is Can You Be Catholic and Feminist, out of Oxford University Press. And Abby's is A Catholic Guide to Miscarriage, Stillbirth, and Infant Loss from Ave Maria Press. So that's tomorrow. While you're on our website signing up for lunch tomorrow, you can also sign up for our mailings if you haven't already. So finally, we do have a space in the context to continue these conversations, and I hope you'll join us. So we have dinner for everyone, dinner reception in the adjoining room. You can go through this little hallway, pick up some dinner, and then there's a seminar room where we can all sit down and chat together. Your ticket to dinner is your survey, which is on your chair. So if you'd... Oh, thank you.